Hey, it's Lou welcoming you to our new series of conversations from Freelands Foundation. Some of you may remember that back in 2022, Larry Achampong and I came together to launch Visualise, the Runnymede Trust and Freelands Foundation report on race and inclusion in secondary school art education. The report examines the current state of race in visual art education at Key Stage 4 in England, confirming what educators have been saying for years, that art education is at a crisis point. Despite their best efforts, teachers and students are rooted in an education system that's failing to nurture diverse art practices. Following the report's publication, I've regrouped with Freelands for this new weekly 5-part series of conversations with art educators, practitioners and makers to dig deeper into the ideas presented by the report and to offer you, our listeners who work in education, a toolkit, if you like, of conversations that we hope will support you in exploring the ideas around providing a more diverse art curriculum for your students. I've included a link to the report and to our guests' work in the show notes that accompany this episode. I hope you enjoy this series of conversations. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Henry Ward and Shabna Begum. Henry is an artist, educator, and the director of Freelands Foundation. Shabna is CEO of the Runnymede Trust. As you heard in my intro, earlier this year, the Runnymede Trust and Freelands Foundation published a report entitled Visualise, Race and Inclusion in Secondary Art Education. And for our conversation today and to launch this series, we'll be taking a bird's eye view of the art education ecosystem in the UK, focusing on representation within the curriculum. Okay, let's dive in. Well, thank you both, Henry and Shabna, for joining me today to talk about the Visualise report that was published earlier this year. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of the detail of that with you, and it's just an absolute pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So the Visualise report, which was published early this year, showed us that quite a bit of work needs to be done when it comes to perhaps updating the current art curriculum, really so that it meets the requirements of today's students and teachers, particularly regarding diversity and inclusion. Can you just give me a little bit of context as to the motivations and the conditions that drove the idea for this report?
The Freelands Foundation has an interest and a focus on visual art education, and we were interested in a situation that we knew was there, which was that there's a significant lack of diversity in terms of who's studying art subjects at school and then beyond. There's a significant lack of diversity in terms of who's teaching those subjects. And we recognised there was a lack of diversity within the curriculum. But what we weren't able to do was put a number to that, really understand exactly what that lack of diversity looked like. So whilst we were very conscious of it through our own experiences with our own careers in other contexts and also with the teachers and schools and bodies that we're working with, we recognised there was a lack of that information actually in the public sphere, and we didn't really understand quite what the situation was, even though we knew that there was a situation that needed looking at. And so I guess Visualise was born out of a desire to understand really what the situation was and then begin to think about how that situation could be addressed. And we reached out to Visualise, and I guess, Shabna, perhaps you want to pick up on Runnymede and Runnymede's side of that.
This is one of those really important partnerships that do really kind of take the assets of two very different organisations and apply them to a specific problem. The Runnymede Trust is the UK's leading racial justice think tank and charity, and we were born in 1968, and education has always been central to the work that we have done. And prior to this particular piece of work, we have done work around curriculum, whether that's with Penguin in terms of lit in colour. We've done some work on a whole piece of work called Our Migration Story, which looks looks at kind of migration journeys both into the UK, empire, colonialism, and the history of what it is to be British. So we have got a track record of kind of investigating and looking at what the curriculum should look like to represent the communities that make up Britain. And I think when we were approached by Freelands Foundation to investigate art education, this was a really valuable opportunity for us, because I think we often talk about an anti-racist curriculum in terms of looking at our historical kind of identity. And we often look at it in terms of geography and history. But I think that the opportunity to look at it within the art curriculum was an opportunity for us to think about how we kind of educate young people across the breadth of the curriculum, and how actually it doesn't have to be an explicit, here we are recording this in Black History Month actually, but that it has to be that we are always identifiably and kind of very performatively sometimes including kind of Black writers or Black history, but actually normalizing it as part of our everyday curriculum. And this is what the partnership gave us, an opportunity to look at a subject area and to really think about what kind of the representation of Black and minority ethnic communities was in that space.
The report did look at many different areas of the curriculum and also GCSE exam papers. And one of the interesting findings was that when referencing artists of colour, the actual percentage of artists of colour referenced is actually very small compared to everything else that's provided in terms of prompts for the students in the curriculum. Just 2.3% of ethnic minority artists are currently in GCSE exam papers. With these findings in mind, how does that practically impact students' learning at the moment?
I mean, for me, the findings around the GCSE exam papers were in some ways the most kind of sobering, because it's the one place in the art curriculum where there's a sort of validation of the diet that's being served to students. So I think it's interesting, just going back to what Shabna was just saying about the previous work that the Runnymede have done in other curriculum areas, and particularly something like the Lit in Colour report. And other curriculum areas within the national curriculum have much more content prescribed. And what's really interesting about the National Curriculum for Art and Design is, in fact, it is barely there. I mean, it's a kind of 2-page document with a few headline things that schools and teachers are meant to cover with their students, but it's extraordinarily open to interpretation. And that provides, of course, fantastic opportunity, but it does also potentially provide real challenge, because it means that there's a reliance on the individual teacher or the individual school to decide on what's being looked at. And what we found was that very often teachers are looking to exam boards to kind of provide a sort of validated resource bank in a way. If the exam boards are suggesting these prompts, then these are artists that perhaps we could use. And teachers are often using past papers, for example, to look at artists and resources that they might use with younger year groups than GCSE and with GCSE classes in preparation towards the exam. So bizarrely, it means that the exam boards, whilst it's not their responsibility, have in their gift the opportunity to ensure that a diverse diet is being offered up to schools and encouraged. Schools are encouraged to use more diverse artists. So the findings from the report that highlighted, as you say, Lou, this kind of extraordinary statistic of not even 3% of cited named artists being artists of colour was really sobering. And I think what that does is there's something about seeing yourself in the things that you are shown, I think, as a student in any subject. The opportunity to believe that something is for you, to believe that something is something that you can access and you can engage with. I think the kind of modelling is really, really important. So what I take from that is that a diet of predominantly white and very often dead artists being shown to students leads to a suggestion that art is a white subject and is a subject that is often happened in the past rather than now. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent. It leads to exclusion. It leads to people feeling something isn't for them. And, it may not be for everybody, but everybody should feel that it could be.
on that, I think that's such an important point, and you make that so well, Henry. And I think it's kind of like when we talk about diversity, we're not talking about supplementing a curriculum. What we're talking about is honesty in the curriculum and an honest representation of kind of the contribution that artists of all sorts of backgrounds have made to our kind of visual art experience. So I think that, like, we often talk about diversity as though we are doing people and communities and children a favor, but actually we're talking about really offering a much more honest a curriculum that reflects the world that we live in and the variety of art that actually is out there. And I think that the other point we made in the report was that not only was it such a low kind of percentage of named artists that came from Black and South Asian backgrounds, but actually that often the references to artists of colour were ones that were quite generic, were located in kind of ancient regional influences or kind of historical periods. And so again, kind of really relegating kind of the contributions made by artists of colour, or people of colour, in a way that is historical and of lower value. And I think, without being overly dramatic about it, I think that this summer we saw some of the worst racist riots that we have seen in generations. And some of the violence, but as the slogans that we heard chanted by people during those really violent events was about this idea for Britain that is white. And I think that there's a real distortion of who we are when we see and witness those racist riots. We see an understanding of Britain and an imaginary of Britain that is completely divorced from who we actually are. And that is at its most violent extreme when we see that violence play out in its streets. But that is kind of subtly supported by school curriculums that do that kind of harm in less violent and aggressive ways, but actually in really damaging ways when we don't afford. And we're not just talking about validating Black and minority ethnic students in the classroom, it's the white students in the classroom as well who kind of deserve to have an honest representation of the world that they live in and of the country that they live in through the art that's shared and explored in their classrooms.
I think, Shabna, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that is so important with what happens next with the report and with the proposed actions is that they're not seen as being things that are purely necessary to take place in more diverse communities. It's arguably almost more important that these things take place in communities that are less diverse, where there's a real opening up and understanding. And I think that the relevance you make to what happened with the riots earlier this year is so true. This blind kind of ignorant view of what Britain is, and this idea of some kind of imagined Britain, that Britain is a extraordinarily richly multicultural, fascinating country, and whether you live in an area that is particularly diverse or not, it shouldn't matter. That the diet should be diverse because that enriches us all.
I've taught the GCSE art and design curriculum myself, and I found that I heavily added to what was being provided in terms of resources that came with the worksheets and things that I was provided. And what I really found was that by supplementing with, contemporary artists from all over the world, artists from all types of background that work in a diverse range of mediums as well, that have so many different things to say, what that did was really encourage the connectivity between the students and their lives. And that's something I think sometimes that we do forget, that actually it benefits all of us. And I'm just thinking, when we do get this right, how does that kind of impact the students in terms of how they move through the education system and perhaps go into the arts sector?
For the past 14 years, we've seen a kind of an anti-arts rhetoric from the powers that be, a kind of diminishing of the sort of validation of the and importance of the subject. And I think that, coupled with the lack of diversity in terms of seeing within resources, of seeing yourself reflected, it just compounds the idea that this isn't something that's for you. This isn't something that you can do. I think that we can't underestimate the importance of modelling in that, of recognising people like you doing the thing that you might be interested in. As a sector, we've seen a 65% drop in the uptake of GCSEs in art and design across the board. I mean, that's an extraordinary drop over the last 10 years. And it's to the detriment of everybody in society. Of course, not everybody should and would want to study art through the whole of school and beyond school, but everybody should feel that they could. One of the subtexts of the Visualise report, whilst it was very focused on looking at diversity, one of the subtexts for me is around how a kind of erosion of the importance of the subject impoverishes all of us. That this inability to open things up and provide access for everyone leads to a narrower group of people feeling that they can study this. And I think when you look at the statistics in the report around who is going on to study art and design, who goes on then to teach art and design, you're unlikely to go on and teach it if you didn't study it to a high level. We've got, a massive shift in the demographic of who goes on to art college to study art and design. It's a completely different looking cohort now to what it was 15, 20 years ago. And I think that's really worrying, and I think it's really dangerous. And I think that, part of the actions in the report that it is about beginning to change that, recognizing that will take time. But I think for me, education is if it's done well, it's the great leveler. We all come from different backgrounds. We've all got different advantages and disadvantages. We've all got different contexts. But if school provides you with access to everything, if school provides you with opportunities in everything, it can be the great leveler. And you might come from a family where you've never been taken into a museum or a gallery, or you've never been taken to the theatre. And then if school does that and you realise it's for you and that it can be for you, that's great. But equally, you might come from a family where you've never been taken to a first division football match and gone through the turnstiles. But if school did that for you, you might discover that's for you too. And I think it should be a great cultural leveler in that way. It should open up access to everything for everybody and allow us all to make decisions that aren't informed by prejudices and aren't informed by cultural expectations, but are informed by what you're interested in.
We always recognise that education is the engine of kind of social mobility, and that it opens doors and opportunities when it's done well. And I think that particularly in the case of art education, one of the points that we make in the report is around why art is so important in terms of kind of the cultural identity, the imaginary that we have about who we are, that big picture kind of social psyche. And I think that it presents such a valuable opportunity to do that in a soft way. We don't have to talk about things in a direct and explicit way. It's just part of our cultural identity. And if we can have that represented in the art curriculum and in the art classroom, then that does so much kind of valuable work for building the kind of social connections and networks that just normalize who we actually are. And I think that we also make the case in the report that when there is so much significant material hardship, we can often kind of think that, as Henry kind of made the point, that art subjects, creative subjects are not as important. We need to kind of think about kind of economic growth in a really kind of mercenary way. And actually, we really undo so much of the valuable work that we are doing in schools in terms of growing children and young people who are able to kind of engage with the world around them in a positive and productive way. And also kind of like we're thinking about emotional well-being. Again, I think that lots of your listeners will be very familiar with the benefits of kind of art in terms of being able to kind of cope with some of the stresses and then the anxieties that children and young people are exposed to. And so I think, again, where we deny children, young people kind of the ability to see themselves or the pathways through kind of art and kind of the creative industries and to see themselves as having opportunities in those spaces, then we kind of really deny both the wider world, the kind of the virtues of what may come from those children and young people, but also those young people themselves as well.
There's some really encouraging positives that have come from the report, particularly in the area of enthusiasm that not only students but also teachers have. And I would just like to think about how we can support our teachers in feeling more confident to deliver a diverse curriculum. How can we try and bring that confidence into the classroom for teachers?
In the report, we do talk about teachers, and we spoke to kind of teachers both through focus groups, interviews, and through a national survey that we conducted. And I think that there was a real sense that teachers had a desire and kind of an ambition to be able to teach in a way that represented their classrooms, the communities, and the broader kind of art space to their children and young people. But many of them, I think 37% of them said that they hadn't been introduced to kind of artists of colour themselves in their own education. So obviously we've got teachers who are operating with having been kind of grown through this kind of educational space already. So they don't have the confidence necessarily through their own kind of educational journeys to take what they've learned and apply it in the classroom. But teachers were really interested in any additional support materials, in exam boards, providing additional kind of materials to help them deliver more diverse and inclusive lessons. So there's a real appetite for teachers to want to teach better. But I think there was also a real lack of confidence, not only around content, but also around the actual kind of language and how to talk about race and racism in the classroom. And I think that happened because there is no teacher training around that. So we don't have any compulsory racial literacy training in initial teacher training or in ongoing CPD afterwards. So I think there's a deficiency within our kind of teacher training programs. But I think that on top of that, in the last few years, I think that kind of the language around the culture wars, language around, for example, the government kind of saying that you can't talk about critical race theory in schools, that kind of rhetoric has also kind of created a real anxiety within kind of the teaching community about what can and can't be said. And the default becomes, well, if I might get it wrong, I won't say it at all. I won't go there. So I think that we need to do there's multiple things that need to happen. We need exam boards to be directing teachers so that they are kind of directed toward teaching more kind of artists from different backgrounds and ethnicities. I think we need the government needs to kind of really be directing that as well, and also making sure that our kind of initial teacher training programs and CPD require and make it mandatory to have some of that racial literacy training. And that should be for all teachers, not just art teachers, so that everyone who's teaching in the classroom should be able to kind of grapple with some of the questions that children and young people will want to pose to them and who are having these questions in amongst themselves, and that they should be able to raise in the classroom. So I think that we saw that there are teachers who really want to and are trying hard, as you kind of said, Lou, from your experience, about kind of trying their very best to try and do more, but the system itself isn't necessarily supporting them, and so we need that system to work better around them.
I think one of the huge positives for me coming out of the report was the very evident appetite from students and from teachers to want to diversify the curriculum, to want to teach with more diverse artists, to want to explore more diverse practices. But as Shabna says, there is a lack of confidence there, and there is also a fear there, and it's a fear of getting it wrong. And I think, in terms of what can be done to address that, we were very clear when we were working on this with Runnymede, and we had discussions about, who is the report for? Who do we want to read the report? Where are the actions placed? And we made decisions that we weren't really writing this report for teachers. And we were very conscious that it's very easy in circumstances when you're talking about these kinds of issues for the finger of blame to be pointed at, well, why aren't teachers doing a better job? And actually, I think teachers are doing an incredibly difficult job, and they're doing it as well as they can. But it's very hard, and what they need are better support, better resources for this. And I think, so as Shabna said, teacher training which actively embraces anti-racist education, teacher training which embraces racial literacy learning, which is enabling teachers to feel confident about tackling those issues when they arise, but also that does support, in the context of art and design teachers, does support them in diversifying a curriculum which, as Shabna said, often for themselves wasn't the way that they experienced it. And then I think, it is where exam boards have a part to play, going back to what I was saying initially about, they are at the moment the only place that appears to validate certain artists as artists that should be looked at. So their responsibility is huge, and it's an easy thing for them to do. Diversifying exam papers is an easy first step. And just to be positive about it, there are 4 exam boards used in the UK. We spoke to all 4 exam boards about the actions that were targeted to them. 2 of those exam boards, Pearson's and the Welsh Board, agreed immediately to meet the initial targets. We've been in continued conversations with AQA, who I have to say have made enormous changes and shifts in their recent papers. Their 2024 papers were significantly better. For some reason, they're not yet committing to meeting the target. And for some reason, their specimen papers do not reflect the good work that they're doing. But it is a move in the right direction. And I think we are seeing examples beginning to recognize that they have this power and this responsibility where they could help to diversify the sort of artists that people are looking at. And I do think that's a first step. But I think, as Shabna said, the appetite from teachers to do something about this is huge. But we now need to ensure that the relevant bodies can support that.
Just to wrap up, we have just touched there on some of the positive changes that have happened since the report was published. One of them was the AQA exam paper. Is there anything else that we can touch on or we are looking to in terms of changes that we are seeing happening post-report, or other areas that we'd like to see changes and action to be taken?
The thing that's been most positive for me is the beginning of conversations with exam boards. I hesitate to say it feels like we're in an early stage in that in terms of the shifting, but it does feel like we're beginning to turn that around. I think the other thing that's been really positive has been how widely the report seems to have been, on a personal level within my capacity at the foundation, the number of times in the last sort of 6 months that I've been in often quite unexpected situations where what the report found, what the report has said, has come up in conversation and actually seems to be affecting people in ways we hadn't necessarily intended. So on the one hand, as I said before, the report was not really intended for teachers. We weren't expecting teachers to read it. I mean, we've all been teachers. We all know that you don't have time to sit down and read something like this necessarily. And yet actually, I've been really pleasantly surprised by the number of times I've been in conversations with teachers who said, I read the report, and then go on to talk about the things it's already helping them to shift in their own practice as individuals. And I think that's something that I wasn't necessarily anticipating, and I've been very, very pleasantly surprised by and very excited by actually about the kind of the potential for grassroots action on this, if individual teachers in different schools are saying, actually, I can make some changes here myself. So I think that's been one thing. And then I think the other thing has been where it's popped up in other conversations and where people have talked about referencing Runnymede when they're having conversations, even in contexts that aren't directly about education. So I think it's a powerful document with some sobering and alarming statistics and material in it, but ultimately with some quite clear ideas about how we could go on to make things better. And I do think that's been a really positive thing. And I think it's going to lead to some really positive actions.
Obviously, since the publication of the report, we've got a new government in place, and they have opened out a broader curriculum and assessment review with Professor Becky Francis leading that. And whilst it doesn't have anti-racism as the core part of its mission, it is very much there to look at what's working, what's not working, and really take that holistic view. So from a Runnymede Trust perspective, we're participating in the consultation that's been opened, and the kind of findings from Visualise will be very much part of the submissions that we make to the government, and trying to move the conversation forward around some of those findings.
Hey, it's Lou, just popping back to say thank you for listening to this conversation made in collaboration with Freelands Foundation. Find out more by following the links in the podcast show notes and subscribe to Shade Podcast to catch all the episodes in this series, where we'll be taking a deeper dive into the art curriculum and how we can support each other in effecting change. This series was produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensah. It was mixed by Tess Davidson, and the original music was composed for Shade Podcast by Brian Jackson. I'll see you next time.